Margaret Whittaker had lived in the same house for over 30 years. It wasn't a grand house, just a modest two-story on the outskirts of town, the kind that wore the years well, with its ivy-covered walls and wooden floors that creaked beneath each step. The walls were filled with memories, though they often felt more like ghosts. Her husband, Henry, had been the love of her life. They had married young, and though their life had never been rich with material wealth, it was rich in love and simple pleasures. However, their happiness was not meant to last. Henry died suddenly in his early 60s, an unexpected heart attack that left Margaret alone, with nothing but memories of their quiet, unassuming life together. The grief of losing him never fully left Margaret. She found comfort in routine, the same old house, the same old town, and the same old quiet existence. There were no children, no extended family, just her and Henry. He had been a reserved man, never discussing his family in detail. When Margaret asked about his past, he would always change the subject. And so, Margaret had lived on, in the same routine, without ever wondering about his mysterious past. It was on a rainy afternoon in early spring, 30 years after Henry's death, when Margaret's life changed forever. She was cleaning out the attic, something she had put off for years, when she came across a box she hadn't seen before. It was tucked under a pile of old blankets, its edges worn, but the name written in bold, neat handwriting still visible: Henry Whittaker. Opening it, Margaret discovered a bundle of old documents, photographs, and a letter from a lawyer. The letter's contents left her stunned. Henry was the heir to a vast family fortune, a fortune he had kept hidden for decades. It was the last thing Margaret had expected. And yet, as she sat in the attic surrounded by forgotten memories, the weight of it settled in her chest. The life she had lived, the life she had thought was all there was built on secrets Henry had never shared. Margaret sat frozen in the attic, clutching the yellowing letter from the lawyer in her trembling hands. The words swam before her eyes as she reread them, hoping that somehow she had misunderstood. Dear Mrs. Whittaker, it is with great respect that I write to inform you of an inheritance left by your late husband, Henry Whittaker. It is my solemn duty to notify you of his position as the sole heir to a significant family estate, which includes assets valued at a substantial sum. We are prepared to meet with you at your earliest convenience to discuss the details of this inheritance, as well as to ensure the legal process is properly handled. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience. Sincerely, G. Edward Parker, Attorney at Law. The words echoed in her ears. Henry, quiet, humble Henry, had been the heir to a family fortune, a fortune Margaret knew nothing about. She had assumed they were just an ordinary couple, living an ordinary life. Henry had always worked as a mechanic, coming home covered in grease, his hands rough from the work, his mind focused on nothing but his trade. But apparently, his roots ran deeper, much deeper. It was as if a different man had lived beneath the surface of her husband, someone with wealth and status, someone with secrets he had taken to his grave. Margaret's hands began to shake as she reached for the other papers in the box. There were documents, wills, deeds, and certificates that outlined a lineage she had never known existed. Henry's family had been prominent in the early 1900s, owning property, businesses, and a vast fortune passed down through the generations. But Henry had kept it all hidden, his quiet demeanor the only clue to the secrets he had buried. As Margaret sat there, piecing together this startling discovery, a wave of conflicting emotions washed over her. The shock was overwhelming, but there was also an undeniable sense of betrayal. How could Henry have kept this from her? Why hadn't he shared this wealth with her, with them, when they had struggled to make ends meet over the years? The realization stung, leaving her with more questions than answers. She knew she had to visit the lawyer, but as the date for the meeting approached, the weight of her decision grew heavier. Margaret had always lived a modest life, never desiring more than she needed. But now, everything had changed. She was faced with a fortune she didn't know how to manage, a legacy she wasn't prepared for. Margaret arrived at the lawyer's office with a heavy heart and a mind full of unanswered questions. The sleek, glass-fronted building stood in stark contrast to the humble life she had known for decades. She felt out of place as she walked through the polished doors, the weight of the letter in her hand now feeling like a physical burden. Inside, the lawyer's office was tastefully decorated, with leather chairs and dark wood accents that spoke of wealth and old money elegance. G. Edward Parker, the lawyer who had reached out to her, greeted her with a warm yet formal handshake. His sharp suit and neatly combed hair suggested someone who was used to dealing with matters of great importance. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, motioning for her to take a seat. "It's a pleasure to meet you. I understand this news must be quite a shock." Margaret could barely respond, her throat tightening with anxiety. She sat down across from him, clutching her purse in her lap as though it could shield her from the flood of emotions threatening to overtake her. "Please, let me explain everything," Parker continued, pulling out a thick file from his desk drawer. "I know you were unaware of your husband's inheritance, and I can only imagine how this must feel. The Whitaker family was once one of the most respected families in this region. But Henry, your husband, chose to distance himself from that life." Margaret nodded, still processing the shock of it all. Parker leaned forward, opening the file to reveal more legal documents. "What you may not know is that Henry inherited not just property, but also shares in several businesses, a private trust, and an old estate that was in his family for generations. The value of the estate is difficult to quantify, but it includes real estate holdings in multiple states, private investments, and antique collections valued at millions of dollars." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. $1-million estates? Antique collections? It all felt surreal. She had lived in a modest house with Henry, never dreaming that such wealth lay hidden behind the veil of his quiet, unassuming nature. But as the lawyer spoke, she could see the reality of it setting in. The inheritance was real, and it was hers now. "But," Parker paused, eyeing her carefully, "there's a catch. The will stipulates that the fortune be handled carefully, and that it remains largely within the family. As of now, you are the sole beneficiary, but the wealth comes with certain obligations." "Obligations?" Margaret asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and fear. "Some of the family's assets have conditions attached. If you choose to accept this inheritance, there are decisions that need to be made carefully. You'll have to decide what to keep, what to sell, and what direction you want the fortune to take moving forward." Margaret felt overwhelmed. She had always managed her finances with caution, scrimping and saving where necessary. She was not prepared to navigate the complexities of a fortune this large. Yet deep down, she knew she had little choice but to move forward. But how? The weeks that followed the lawyer's office meeting were a whirlwind of activity. Margaret barely had time to process the enormity of her situation. Every day seemed to bring a new task, a new decision she had to make about her late husband's estate. She found herself spending long hours at the lawyer's office, poring over documents, signing contracts, and meeting with financial advisors. Despite her attempts to remain calm, the pressure was beginning to take its toll. Margaret was still a widow, grieving for the love of her life, and now she had to navigate a world of wealth and privilege she had never known. The life she had spent 30 years building with Henry suddenly felt like a distant memory, and in its place stood this daunting new reality. One where her every move seemed to come with strings attached. The hardest part was the responsibility that came with the inheritance. The assets were not simply handed over. There were conditions tied to them, including maintaining certain properties, contributing to charitable foundations tied to the Whitaker name, and ensuring that the family's legacy was preserved in some form. Margaret had never been interested in wealth for its own sake. She had always believed in hard work, modesty, and living a simple life. Yet, here she was, with the power to change her own life and the lives of others in unimaginable ways. One morning, Margaret sat in her kitchen, staring at the list of properties and investments that had come with Henry's inheritance. One of the estates alone was valued at over $10 million, and the artwork and collectibles it contained were worth millions more. But with that wealth came complexity. The estate was in disrepair and required millions of dollars in maintenance just to keep it functional. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from her lawyer. "Mrs. Whitaker," Parker's voice sounded on the other end. "We need to discuss the decision about the estate. The deadline for making a choice is coming up, and I want to ensure you are prepared." Prepared? Margaret felt far from prepared. She had never imagined that one day she would be sitting in a mansion that had been passed down through generations of Whitakers, trying to figure out what to do with it. She had always imagined her life would be simple, filled with memories of Henry and the small joys of a life well lived. But now, everything had changed. And the question loomed large. How was she supposed to handle this wealth? Was she even capable of maintaining such a legacy? Or would the fortune destroy the very values she had spent a lifetime cultivating? Margaret let out a sigh and placed her head in her hands. She had spent so many years building a quiet life. Now, She wasn't sure where to start. The weight of the decision was starting to suffocate Margaret. On one hand, she was handed a life-changing fortune, a legacy of wealth and power. But on the other, she was being asked to keep that legacy intact, something she wasn't sure she could, or even wanted to do. Every corner of the grand Whittaker estate seemed to stare at her, the walls holding the memories of generations before her, each one having carried the mantle of family wealth and status. Margaret had never been interested in status. For 30 years, she and Henry had been content with their quiet lives, surrounded by close friends and a simple home. The thought of becoming a lady of the estate, of attending high society galas and rubbing shoulders with people she could barely relate to, left her feeling cold. The world she had been thrust into was unfamiliar, and she felt like an imposter. Her mind often wandered back to the old weathered farmhouse they had lived in for years before Henry's passing. She could still remember the creaky floors, the warm smell of coffee in the morning, and the crackling fire in the evenings. She missed the simplicity of it all, the gentle routine of their days together, without the pressure of having to live up to some great family name. Margaret's thoughts drifted to the property at the heart of the inheritance, the sprawling Whittaker estate, a historical landmark with acres of land, gardens, and buildings that could house dozens of families. The upkeep alone was a massive burden, and that wasn't even considering the art collection, the expensive cars, the vast stocks and bonds that came with it all. A part of her considered selling it all, liquidate the estate, sell the properties, and use the money for something meaningful. She could invest in charities close to her heart, perhaps fund education for underprivileged children or support healthcare initiatives for the elderly, causes Henry had always supported. But as the days passed, the pressure from her late husband's family grew. They expected Margaret to uphold the Whittaker name, to honor their ancestors, and to carry on the traditions of wealth and prominence. The thought of disappointing Henry's family was daunting, but how could she live a life that didn't feel authentic? One afternoon, as Margaret walked through the grand halls of the Whittaker estate, she paused in front of a large portrait of her late father-in-law. His stern face seemed to scrutinize her from the frame, his eyes sharp with an unspoken expectation. It was then that she realized she was at a crossroads. Whatever she decided, the choice would not only shape her future, but also affect her relationship with her in-laws and the legacy she would leave behind. She stood there for what seemed like an eternity, battling with herself. Could she turn her back on this legacy? Would she be able to accept the wealth if it meant losing her peace of mind? Days turned into weeks, and Margaret felt the weight of her newfound responsibility more heavily with each passing hour. The fortune that had been hidden for decades, now in her hands, felt like both a blessing and a curse. The inheritance was more than just money. It was a complicated web of expectations, legalities, and relationships that she never imagined she would have to navigate. Her thoughts often drifted to the day she first learned of her inheritance. That fateful phone call from the lawyer had been so abrupt, the words so surreal. "Mrs. Whittaker, I regret to inform you that you have inherited a substantial portion of the Whittaker estate. Your late husband, Henry, left behind an extensive collection of assets that include properties, stocks, bonds, and fine art." She remembered her hands trembling as she listened, a mix of disbelief and confusion flooding her mind. At first, it had all seemed like a mistake. How could she, a widow living in a modest home, be the recipient of such wealth? The idea seemed so distant from the life she had known. But as the days went on, the truth settled in like a weight she couldn't escape. Now, as she sat in the parlor room of the Whittaker estate, the legal documents spread across the coffee table in front of her, Margaret struggled with a moral dilemma. The estate's wealth wasn't simply hers to do as she pleased. She was part of a legacy, one that had been built over generations. If she chose to sell it all, to rid herself of the family's wealth and tradition, what would that say about her? Would she be forever branded as the one who discarded her family's heritage? But the more she thought about it, the more the idea of preserving the Whittaker name felt hollow. She wasn't Henry's replacement. She wasn't meant to wear the mantle of someone she had never met. The idea of continuing the Whittaker family's business empire, of turning a profit from the very assets she had no emotional attachment to, left her feeling cold inside. Margaret's heart was torn between two worlds. One told her to honor her husband's memory, to keep the estate intact and uphold the legacy. The other told her that this wealth was not hers to carry alone. If Henry had truly wanted her to inherit it, she had to be true to herself and figure out how she would use it. In an attempt to clear her mind, Margaret decided to take a long walk through the grounds of the estate. The wind whipped through the trees as she walked across the sprawling lawns. The beauty of the land was undeniable. Flowers blooming in every corner, the soft chirping of birds in the distance. But even in nature's serenity, her mind remained clouded with uncertainty. Margaret found herself standing in front of the family mausoleum, her breath shallow as she thought of Henry. The quietness of the estate seemed to speak to her, urging her to think deeper about what she wanted her life to be moving forward. Could she balance the moral implications of her choices with the weight of the fortune she had inherited? The decision was made quietly, almost imperceptibly. It was as if the air around Margaret had shifted, signaling to her that this was the moment of truth. She had spent countless nights awake, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with the moral complexities of the wealth that had come her way. But now, standing in front of the Whittaker family mausoleum, the answer seemed clear. Margaret realized that the fortune she had inherited wasn't just about money. It was about the legacy that came with it, the decisions that defined who she was and who she wanted to be. This wealth, tied to her late husband's name and family history, would forever be part of her. But how she chose to handle it would define the rest of her life. She couldn't simply keep it as if it were a treasure chest to be guarded. She couldn't throw it all away either, as though it were a burden that she had no claim to. What she could do, however, was something entirely different. Something that had never occurred to her before. "I will use this money for something meaningful," she whispered to herself. Not for wealth, but for purpose. Margaret understood now. The fortune wasn't her inheritance to hoard or squander. It was a tool, a means to an end, not the end itself. Her heart beat faster as she thought of all the possibilities. There were countless organizations that could benefit from her newfound wealth, causes that aligned with her values, her passion for helping others. She could fund educational initiatives, contribute to medical research, or even help rebuild impoverished communities. But there was one more thing Margaret realized. This wealth, this legacy, wasn't just about making the right choices for herself. It was about honoring Henry's memory in a way that truly mattered. Henry had always been a man of integrity, known for his philanthropy and generosity. If she could honor that part of him, then perhaps she could find peace with the inheritance. Determined, Margaret made a vow that day, a vow to use the fortune for the greater good. She would not let it define her, but she would use it to help others, to leave a legacy of her own. As she walked away from the mausoleum, Margaret knew that her journey was only beginning. She would spend the next several months carefully considering her options, meeting with financial advisors and consulting with trusted individuals. Margaret had made her choice. She begins taking action toward turning her vision into reality. Would this be the breakthrough she'd been waiting for? Or would the weight of her decisions become even heavier to bear? With a new sense of clarity, Margaret set her mind to action. She knew that her decision to use the fortune for greater good required more than just lofty intentions. It needed a well-thought-out plan, backed by careful decisions and hard work. No longer was she simply a widow grieving her late husband. She was now a woman tasked with a responsibility that stretched beyond herself. The first step was to meet with financial advisors who could help her navigate the complexities of her newfound wealth. As the attorneys, accountants, and experts lined up in her elegant drawing room, Margaret was struck by the stark contrast to the life she had once known. She had never been one to focus on money for money's sake. But now the conversations were dominated by tax strategies, charitable trusts, and asset management. It was overwhelming at first, the sheer scope of what she had inherited, the weight of the decisions that lay ahead. But Margaret was no stranger to tough choices. She had faced loss and hardship before, and this felt like another challenge to overcome. As the meetings stretched into weeks, Margaret slowly gained a sense of confidence in her financial future. One of her key decisions was to establish a foundation that would focus on causes that had always been close to her heart. Her late husband, Henry, had been deeply involved in educational initiatives for underprivileged children, and Margaret felt this was the perfect way to honor his memory. She worked with her advisors to set up the foundation, carefully selecting trustees who shared her values. The process was both thrilling and exhausting. She pored over mission statements, interviewed potential board members, and started mapping out programs that would have the most impact. It wasn't just about writing checks. It was about creating something sustainable, something that could transform lives for years to come. Margaret began to feel a sense of purpose she hadn't known in years. The fortune she had inherited was no longer an anchor dragging her down. It was a vessel ready to carry her toward a brighter future. But even as she took these first steps, she couldn't help but wonder, was she truly prepared for the consequences of this new chapter? Would her decisions truly honor her husband's legacy, or would they bring unforeseen challenges? Months passed and Margaret's foundation began to take root. Programs were set up to help children access quality education, scholarships were awarded, and new schools in underserved areas were funded. It was rewarding to see tangible changes, but along with the positive outcomes came the ever-growing pressure of managing a foundation of such scale. As her foundation gained traction, Margaret's life began to feel like a balancing act. She had more power than she had ever imagined. Power to change lives, power to influence policy, power to make a difference. But that power came with a price. She was constantly pulled in different directions by media attention, requests for donations, and the expectations of the people around her. One day, she received an invitation to a gala in honor of a new partnership between her foundation and a powerful business tycoon. It was a lavish event, held at a grand hotel, with dozens of philanthropists and business leaders in attendance. Margaret had never liked the world of high society networking, but she couldn't avoid it now. As she entered the glittering ballroom, her presence was immediately noticed. She was no longer just the widow. She was the woman behind a fortune, the face of a movement. It was there, amidst the swirling champagne glasses and eloquent speeches, that Margaret met Sarah, a young girl who had benefited from the scholarships funded by her foundation. Sarah, now in her final year of college, was standing near the stage, nervously clutching a microphone. When the organizers asked her to speak, she shared her story of how Margaret's foundation had allowed her to escape the cycle of poverty and attend a prestigious university. The room fell silent as Sarah spoke, her words raw with emotion. "I wouldn't be here without you," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "You gave me the chance I never thought I'd have." Margaret's heart swelled. As Sarah finished her speech, she made her way toward Margaret, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," Sarah whispered. In that moment, Margaret realized something profound. This was what she had been searching for. The wealth, the legacy, the uncertainty. It all made sense now. It wasn't about the money, the decisions, or the challenges. It was about the lives she could touch, the futures she could change. She hadn't just inherited a fortune. She had inherited a responsibility to carry her husband's mission forward, and she was doing it. Conclusion. Margaret's journey reminds us all that life is full of unexpected twists and turns. What would you do if you found yourself in her shoes? Would you rise to the occasion, or would you be overwhelmed by the burden of it all? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you've enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring tales of unexpected riches and life-changing decisions.